and welcome to our first World of Wonder and Science presentation of 2023. WoW stands for World of Wonder. And this is a seminar series that's focused on scientists' journeys and their research. And the series is hosted by the Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate program. I'm very excited to introduce all of you today to our presenter, Dr. Kathleen Bogart. Dr. Bogart is an associate professor of psychology at Oregon State University. She earned her PhD in 2012 from Tufts University in experimental social psychology. And as a person with a disability, Dr. Bogart is passionate about researching, educating, and writing about ableism. Dr. Bogart is also a prolific researcher. I looked on Google Scholar and there were more articles than I could count. I think it was maybe around 90 publications. I could be wrong about that. But a very prolific researcher. And as an advocate for people with disabilities, Dr. Bogart is the co-founder of the Disability Advocacy and Research Network, or DARN, which is for social and personality psychologists who have and/or specialize in disability. And she's also the faculty advisor for OSU's Disabled Students Union. Dr. Bogart presents to and consults with international audiences, including TEDx audiences, to talk about disability awareness, disability as diversity, and facial paralysis. She also blogs about these topics for Psychology Today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bogart. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It is such an honor to be here, and I have to say I'm looking forward most to talking with you after my presentation. So I'll get started. So I want to start by sharing my story. I have been interested in communication and disability ever since I was born. And that's because I was born with a very rare syndrome called Mobius syndrome. And that means that my 6th and 7th cranial nerves in my brainstem were underdeveloped. And so that results in facial paralysis and limited side-to-side eye movement. When I was pretty young, I started to understand that I communicated differently from most people, and that people sometimes had trouble understanding what I was trying to say and how I was feeling. And somewhat naturally, I developed what I now call alternative communication, where I became more expressive in my body and voice. And, you know, many people in this room may be familiar with the story that I'm telling, and they resonate with you in terms of learning how to communicate in your own ways. One thing that I do struggle with is because of my facial paralysis, my lips don't move as one would expect them to. I had many years of speech therapy to speak relatively clearly, but I often find that when I interact with hard of hearing people who are accustomed to reading my lips, they are not able to read my lips because my lips are doing a very different thing from what they are accustomed to. So I am happy to share my slides or explain things in a different way way if people need me to. My experience communicating differently led me to be very interested in verbal communication, written communication, and body language. And ultimately, that led me to be interested in studying psychology, that is the study of social psychology and nonverbal communication, and English. So I'm going to switch to my next slide here, which starts my academic journey. I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I wasn't very creative when I thought about where I would go to undergrad. I just went to the undergrad institution that was in my hometown. And I double majored in exactly those things, psychology and English. I felt like it could kind of go either way. I really liked both. I ended up spending time as a research assistant in 2 different psychology labs, and throughout learning more about psych research, and also learning about how to do my own research on topics, I became interested in seeing what psychology had to say about Mobius syndrome and about facial movement disorders. And actually, I was disappointed to find out that the answer was very little. I could count on one hand how many studies in psychology had been published on Mobius syndrome. And so that gave me an early inkling that maybe I could do something to build up the research in that area. I was the one with unique insight and motivation to do it. It didn't seem like anyone else was. So I knew that I wanted to eventually go on to grad school. But in the meantime, I wanted to take a break, take a gap year or two, and see what my psychology and English undergrad degrees could do for me in the meantime. And I ended up working as a case manager, and later it was called a support coordinator for children and older adults who are on Medicaid in the state of Louisiana. I learned so much in that job in terms of interacting with people from different backgrounds and different types of disabilities. And looking back on it, I didn't even consider myself to be one of them. I didn't consider myself to have a disability at that time. And, I have a lot to say about that, but, I think one reason is that I had a very rare condition. It was never called a disability to me. And we have, very kind of rigid ideas about what a disability looks like or sounds like. So I saw myself as an ally to my clients with disabilities, but I did not at that time feel solidarity with them. And I feel like that was a big missed opportunity to really have a true connection. So working as a case manager for a few years was frustrating, honestly. The state of Louisiana had very low opportunities for funding and support for my clients. So often it felt like I would visit with my clients and hear about what they needed and only be able to give them a tiny pittance of what they deserved and what they were entitled to. So at that point, I decided it was time to go back to graduate school. I felt like I could make, hopefully, a bigger difference by working at a higher level, doing work that might be able to affect ableism and affect policy at a broader scale. So around the time I was thinking about graduate school, I also started to develop my disability identity for the first time. I went to my very first Mobius Syndrome Foundation conference, where I met many other people with Mobius syndrome. It was a really transformative experience for me because I had never met anyone with Mobius syndrome or facial paralysis in my entire life before. And finally, I was surrounded by a room full of people who looked like me at the age of 25. So once I went to my first Mobius Syndrome Foundation conference, I got really involved. I haven't missed a conference since, and over the years I've developed like a feeling like this community is my family, and lots of great connections. And as I've continued through my work in advocacy, I've taken on roles on the boards of the Mobius Syndrome Foundation. And the feedback from the community and grant support from the Mobius Syndrome Foundation has been instrumental in doing the work that I do today. So I actually attended that first conference the week before I started graduate school at San Francisco State University. And I worked with Dr. David Matsumoto in the psychology department there. Psychology graduate programs are formed on a mentorship model. This means that you need to find a researcher who will be your advisor, who has research expertise in the area of scholarship that you would ultimately like to pursue. Well, that was really hard given that no one was out there researching Mobius syndrome. So first, I sought to find people who were interested in nonverbal communication, and I found a really apt mentor in Dr. Matsumoto because he was an expert on facial expression. And so I completed my degree at San Francisco State in a couple of years and translated some of his facial expression research into the Mobius syndrome community. And that was the first time I was able to leverage my relationship with the Mobius Syndrome Foundation to reach out to participants. And then it was time to get my PhD, and I had to move on because SF State didn't have a PhD program. So I was back to the drawing board again and finding a mentor who might have the expertise to work with me. So I ended up finding a great mentor match with some allies. So I ended up having two mentors. The first was Linda Tickle-Negnan, who was an occupational therapist and a social psychologist by training. So she really had the perfect combo of interest in social interaction as well as applications to the disability community. And you can see me and Dr. Tickle-Degnan here at my graduation. And my other mentor was Nalini Ambady, who was an expert in first impressions and nonverbal communication research. And here is Dr. Ambady. And here I am at our PhD hooding ceremony, and I was the commencement speaker for that ceremony. So that was a real honor. So moving on from there, I was on the lookout for faculty positions, and people who are graduating with a PhD in psychology and interested in doing academic work often have the choice between a postdoc and a faculty position. Honestly, often it's not much of a choice anymore. It's almost expected that you take a postdoc first in order to get more experience and publications under your belt. It happened that I was able to get a position at Oregon State right out of my graduate program, and I didn't end up doing a postdoc. I'm happy to talk about kind of the pros and cons of that approach if you do end up having that option. I was happy to be able to kind of move on to the next stage of my career and feel more settled down in a place. I moved to Oregon State University for this job in 2015. 2012 and have lived in the same city ever since. So it's been 10 years, and that has been really nice, given all of the moving around that I did for graduate school. If I had taken a postdoc, then, chances are I would have been moving around much more. So I wanted to share a picture here that's really special to me. This is me hooding my first PhD student. Her name is Dr. Brooke Bryson, and she just graduated this past spring. So that was a really exciting full circle moment for me. So to tell you about kind of how my research has grown and changed over the years, I thought I could use these concentric circles. So at first, I was very focused on research around Mobius syndrome. This seemed really important to me because, as I said, there was no research in the psychology field about it. So there was a really important gap to fill for the hundreds of people that I knew with Mobius syndrome. So my first few research studies focused on Mobius syndrome. And then I started to understand that there were commonalities among people with Mobius syndrome and other types of facial paralysis. So there are many other conditions that can result in facial movement restrictions, including Bell's palsy, including stroke, including a variety of other rare conditions like acoustic neuroma damage, Ramsay-Hunt. And so I began to include those groups in my research as well and look at the commonalities and differences. One of the commonalities is that all of these groups seem to use alternative expression, this way of communicating that I mentioned earlier. One of the differences that I have found is the distinction between congenital and acquired facial paralysis. I was born with myofascial paralysis. It's more common to develop facial paralysis at a later point in life. And I think that there are some very interesting and important differences in the experience of developing identity and adapting to one's condition when you are born with it versus when you acquire it later in life. And I think there are some very obvious parallels to the deaf community here. And then I went even broader and started to understand that both Mobius syndrome and facial paralysis were what are considered rare disorders. And that actually has a very specific definition in America. That is a disorder affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans. So I started to understand that of the actually 7,000 different rare disorders, there were some shared commonalities. One of them being feeling isolated and feeling a lot of stigma because the general population may not understand what you are experiencing or the way you look or the way you communicate. And so I've done a lot of research in that sphere as well. And then finally, I expanded more broadly into disability as a whole, which includes rare disorders and common conditions. And again, I'm interested in those similarities and differences across experiences. As a psychologist, I am not so interested in the underlying biological factors in disorders. I am more interested in the mental health and social experiences of people with disabilities. And it does happen that there are a lot of similarities, right? We all experience isolation, we all experience ableism, and we all are very creative and resourceful in our ways of adapting to an ableist world. So that's kind of the trajectory that my research has taken broadly. And I want to talk about a few specific research projects that I've done. So I'm going to talk about two different research projects, one about disability identity and disability pride, and one about representation of disability in higher education. And then finally, we'll spend some time musing about how we could resist ableism. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but there are many ways to define disability. One I like is the one from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that says that disability is a physical or mental impairment that interacts with social barriers. And disability is the largest minority group in the United States, affecting 19% of the population or 25% of the adult population. And indeed, it intersects with all other identities. And it intersects with minoritized identities at a high rate, right? So we know that people with disabilities are more likely to be racial or ethnic minorities and sexual minorities, for example. And disability is the only minority group that you can either be born into or you can join it at any time. So this has some really interesting ramifications for identity development. So I've thrown around ableism a few times. Let's define that word. So ableism can be defined in social psychological terms as stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, and social oppression toward people with disabilities. So let's break down those terms. Often the general public kind of uses these terms interchangeably, but in psychology, they have very specific meanings. So stereotyping is beliefs or thoughts that certain attributes are characteristic of members of a particular group. So this means that you can look at a group of people, an ethnic group or a group of people with disabilities, and you believe you know something about them because of a stereotype that you hold of that group membership. And next up is prejudice, and this is negative emotions about members of a particular group. And then finally, discrimination is behavior acting upon stereotypes or prejudice. So ableism includes all of these factors. So the neat thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, people with disabilities are quite creative in how they navigate an ableist world. And one way that we think disabled people fight ableism is through disability pride. And of course, there are parallels with the deaf pride movement as well. And this could be broadly defined as accepting disability as an important and valued part of the self and feeling solidarity with others who share that identity. And this is an image from a New York City Disability Pride parade. And myself and others have actually done research on disability pride, and we found that it's associated with less desire for a cure. It's associated more with congenital disability than it is with acquired disability. And it is associated with lower depression, anxiety, and higher satisfaction with life. So it seems to be protective of one's well-being. Additionally, it's associated with behaviors of advocacy and activism. So in one project, I wanted to expand on the potential benefits of disability pride by using a classic social psychological theory called the rejection identification model. So this model says that experiencing ableism would prompt minority group members, that is, people with disabilities, to reject the majority culture and instead choose to identify with each other as a way to protect their self-esteem. Now, until this research, it had not been examined in people with a variety of disabilities. This theory was developed for racial and ethnic minorities and had also been studied in international students and people with dwarfism. So I predicted that disability pride would mediate the relationship or help explain the relationship between experiencing ableism and self-esteem. So this study involved surveying 710 people from an internet-based survey, and we used established survey measures of ableism. And we also measured disability pride with a scale from Rosalind Darling and Rosenberg's classic self-esteem scale. And I'll just talk you through this model here. What we found, as we might expect, is that experiencing ableism is associated with lower self-esteem. However, experiencing ableism is also associated with increased pride, and pride is associated with higher self-esteem. So it seems that disability pride is able to protect people to some extent from experiencing ableism. So put another way, experiencing ableism is associated with disability pride, which may in turn protect self-esteem against ableism. And if you're anything like me, the next thing I think is, well, how do we foster disability pride if it's protecting people? And the answer is the research is not there yet, but my students and I are actively designing research projects that would actually look at this. Definitely open to suggestions and potential collaborations if anyone's interested. And now I want to talk about our project looking at disability representation in psychology undergraduate education. So we did a content analysis looking at the course offerings of all undergraduate universities that offered a psychology major. We used the US News and World Report's top 100 ranking to pick the top 98. The other two didn't offer psychology majors. So we focused on that group, and we looked at the websites of every university to see what their course offerings were. And then a team of coders looked for the term disability or any synonyms, and also look to see if the description of disability was in a social model angle or in a medical model angle. And what we found was that, as we expected, 100% of the universities offered a class on psychiatric disabilities in psychology. This is absolutely something that we would have thought we would see because psychology is historically focused on what it would call mental disorders or psychological conditions. So these classes were certainly offered. However, there are many other types of disabilities that are more common and natural parts of human diversity that psychology does not seem to be covering. So, for example, looking at chronic health conditions, looking at intellectual disabilities, sensory disabilities, and physical disabilities, they were offered by fewer than half of universities. So we're really getting kind of a one-dimensional curriculum around disability in psychology. And we also found that courses contain significantly more medical than social model content. So disability topics are underrepresented in psychology undergrad curricula, and when they are covered, it is predominantly from a medical model perspective. And, I personally found this upsetting and surprising because my home field of social psychology focuses on the social construction of minority groups. So why doesn't social psychology include disability in its conversations around stereotyping and prejudice? There are a few barriers to increasing representation in psychology. For example, only 2% of psychology faculty at APA accredited programs reported having a disability. I can guarantee you that more than 2% of faculty do have a disability in these programs, but for likely a variety of reasons related to systemic ableism, they did not identify that way. Now, if faculty would like to increase representation of disability, we see that there are not a lot of expert faculty who have a disability experience to draw from. The other thing that faculty will often do in order to enrich their curriculum is to look to textbooks to get information about what to cover. Well, unfortunately, psychology textbooks also have limited and stereotypical disability portrayals. So there are limited opportunities for people to enrich their curricula. Now I want to turn to a study where we looked at the experience of disabled people in undergrad. So in the United States, about 11% of undergrads are disabled. So they are underrepresented because if we were looking at a representative sample, we'd see 19%. But still, 11% is a big chunk of our undergraduates. Unfortunately, those disabled undergrads are 16% less likely than non-disabled undergrads to complete their degree. Now, there are many reasons that I could go into that contribute to this disparity. One that I will mention and focus on here is the idea that students' disability attitudes create a culture of inclusion or exclusion for students with disabilities. They may not feel like they are represented and that they fit in. So I did a study that compared attitudes around disability among students with and without disabilities. And we were able to ask a few questions that spoke to psychological theory here. One is, do disabled and non-disabled students have different model beliefs, different beliefs about disability's underlying cause? So we were able to use a theory called the actor-observer bias. In psychology, this bias talks about how an actor in a situation is more likely to see the role of the situation in their behavior, whereas someone observing another person is likely to attribute that person's behavior to their own internal traits. So a classic example of this is if you see someone walking around and drop a piece of litter on the floor, you might see them and say, oh, they don't care about the environment, they're a horrible person. And then the person in that situation might justify it by saying, well, I really wanted to have a place to throw away this item, but there was absolutely nowhere for me to put it. So that person would see the role of the situation. We think that this applies to disability very nicely. Actors, the insiders, people with disabilities, are more likely to correctly see the external barriers that they are experiencing, whereas observers or non-disabled people are more likely to make internal attributions, meaning they're more likely to attribute the problems around disability to the disabled person or the disability rather than to environmental barriers. So this led us to hypothesize that disabled students would have less ableist and medical model beliefs and stronger social model beliefs than non-disabled students, and that these model beliefs would explain differences in ableism between disabled and non-disabled students. So here we conducted another survey study, this time in a required undergraduate course at Oregon State University. So our sample is quite representative of our undergraduate OSU population, although we can have a conversation about how OSU undergrads are not at all representative of the US general population. We gave them survey measures of ableism and of social and medical model beliefs. And let me walk you through our findings. So on the x-axis, we have the variables that we measured, the beliefs. The gray bars are students without disabilities, and the orange bars are students with disabilities. And we can see that as predicted, students without disabilities had higher ableism, lower social model beliefs, and higher medical model beliefs than students with disabilities. And indeed, our mediation model was also supported. So to say this out in words, disabled students had lower ableism than non-disabled students. And their lower ableism was explained by stronger social model beliefs and lower medical model beliefs compared to students who did not have disabilities. So students with disabilities hold stronger social model, weaker medical model, and less ableist beliefs than those without disabilities. Medical and social model beliefs completely explained the differences in ableism between students with and without disabilities. So this does point to a potential cultural mismatch in disability models and attitudes among disabled and non-disabled students. So as I mentioned, disabled students may be showing up at university and experiencing this feeling of not belonging and having a different culture than those without disabilities. Many people in the audience are probably like nodding their heads and saying, of course, that this is actually kind of like new and exciting information to people who are not in the disability community. So because we saw that social model beliefs were associated with lower ableism, we think that increasing representation of disability, especially under a social model in undergraduate education, could help bridge this gap. So I want to just muse a bit more about findings from my own research and from others about how we might tackle the problem of ableism. There are some barriers to getting rid of ableism, and one of those is what's called solo status. That means that most people with disabilities are born into or find themselves in a family in which no one else has a disability. So this is different from many other minoritized groups, for example, racial and ethnic minorities, in which one or both parents usually share that identity. So it's very challenging to have a fluid identity development when one does not have people nearby you who shares that identity. When people with disabilities are diagnosed, they're given a name for their condition that is a medical diagnosis. And that often encourages people to identify with that specific diagnosis, for example, Mobius syndrome, and not to identify with other groups that might experience similar things. As I described earlier, I had that kind of concentric circle broadening experience. But for the first 25 years of my life, I only identified with Mobius syndrome and thought that, I would probably never meet anyone else with a condition that I could relate to. Additionally, most disabilities are actually invisible, and because of incredible stigma and potential discrimination, some people make the choice to not disclose or come out with a disability. While I certainly support people making individual decisions that keep them safe, this does unfortunately perpetuate the idea that disability is rare. And we have this leaky pipeline that I was alluding to earlier, where people with disabilities are not graduating and getting into higher levels of academia and beyond media, politics, and forming role models. Or if they are in those positions, they're not out. They have invisible disabilities and we don't know that they're there. So this deprives people of the valuable lived experience expertise that you might get if you could talk to, say, a professor who had already been through graduate school with their disability and had some specific tips about how to navigate things. So let's talk about some facilitators, some things that can help us get rid of ableism. Thinking about disability in terms of the social model encourages cross-disability solidarity. So this is, not just identifying with Mobius syndrome, but identifying with people with all sorts of disabilities that have very different biological conditions, but have solidarity around experiencing ableism and environmental barriers. Coming out when it is safe to do so, especially when people are in positions of relative privilege and power, increases the visibility of people with disabilities, their representation, and provides social support. An example that I always like to give is I teach a few classes about the psychology of disability at OSU, and I always model talking openly and frankly about my own disability. And over the course of the class, more people just spontaneously start coming out with their disabilities. And I always hear from at least one or two students at the end of the term that the class inspired them for the first time to seek disability services through our university to get access to things like extended time or note-taking or whatever it was that they needed, right? Whatever it was that they were legally entitled to anyway. And that it turned what had been a, struggle into thriving. And the second thing they always like about these stories is that they end up coming out to some of their friends as well. And what often happens is, they mention to their friends, I have ADHD or I have a learning disability or whatever. And then it turns out that, 3 of their friends also have that disability, but no, everyone was too mired in internalized ableism to say anything, right? So they have instant social support, right, with people who they already know and trust. And so, this is the big one here. We need to be sure that disability is included in high-level diversity initiatives. It's really a hot topic right now to talk about disability, equity, and inclusion, but too often disability is not included as one of those minoritized identities. So not only does this mean naming disability, but it means ensuring that structural level policies are not discriminatory towards people with disabilities. I have plenty of thoughts around how this occurs and how it can be ameliorated in academia. I have, as was mentioned, a whole organization about supporting people with disabilities in psychology. So I'm happy to have conversations about that later as well. So I want to give a couple of examples of ways that my students and I have tried to fight ableism on our own campus. So a few years ago, my lab, my students who were doing research with me, published a paper that found that educating people who were not familiar with facial paralysis about alternative expression and about what facial paralysis is, that there is not as much information to be gleaned from the face, but there is a lot of information that can be gleaned from other channels of communication, and to encourage people to focus on those channels. This research found that indeed people made more positive impressions of people with facial paralysis when they were given this education. And so the lab was inspired to spread the word in our campus community. And so we had an Awareness Day event for Mobius Syndrome Awareness Day, which incidentally is January 24th every year. Yesterday was Mobius Syndrome anniversary, so happy late anniversary to everyone. And so we handed out a little bit of information about facial paralysis. We had games and goodies. And we also encouraged people to share how they express themselves. This was covered in our local paper, and myself and one of my students were on the cover of the local paper, and so that was really fun and exciting. And the main activity that we had people do at our event was to fill out a sign that said, "I express myself with." And then people put in all sorts of creative ideas in order to raise awareness about expressive diversity. So here's a small collection of some of the things that people said. So we had a lot of people with Mobius syndrome talk about creativity and writing. I think that speaks really clearly to our community. Here's me, mine was cooking. I think maybe one of my favorites is my department chair, Kathy Becker-Glees. She came by and said that she expressed herself with data and drew a normal curve. So again, the idea here, and I hope that you all can relate to it, is that people have many different creative ways of communicating, and we should be more aware and open to paying attention to these diverse channels. I also want to share a few resources with you. So I was part of a committee at the American Psychological Association that updated a very old set of guidelines around supporting people with disabilities who come in for psychotherapy. This is available freely online, and people who are interested in going into psychology, especially into clinical work, I highly recommend checking it out. I'll have contact info at the end where you can get in touch with me to find this. And I also want to plug my organization, DARN. It stands for Disability Advocacy and Research Network. And this is a screenshot of our website. It's at darndisability.org. And here we have a place where anyone who's interested in connecting with others can add their information about what their research or teaching or clinical interest is, where they are, and if they're interested in collaborating. They can disclose a disability if they want to find others with a similar experience, but they don't have to. We have a variety of resources. We have quarterly virtual Zoom meetings where we can connect. And we also have in-person sessions associated with the Social Psychology Conference, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, which is our funding organization. So I want to thank you so much for your attention today. If you'd like to keep in touch, there's a variety of ways. If you're interested in learning more about the psychology of disability or communicating some kind of simple, publicly accessible information about it, you can check out my Psychology Today blog. I find it to be especially useful for undergrads or people who aren't in academia because things are explained in an easy to understand way. And if you happen to be a QR code person, you can access many of these links with the QR code. So I will stop there, and I am excited to hear your thoughts and questions.
So for undergraduate students right now who are thinking about going into graduate school, you already shared a lot of good tips, but is there any specific advice that you have for students with disabilities who are thinking about picking graduate schools or picking mentors?
So my number one answer whenever you ask me for advice for students is to connect with others with disabilities. And it can be cross-disability connections. It doesn't have to be the same disability. Because you learn a lot from other students about how to navigate the system. So that's step one. I also highly recommend doing your research on the mentors themselves. I would give this advice to anyone with a disability or without. In psychology, we really do follow this apprenticeship model. So you will have a very important and long-lasting relationship with whoever becomes your mentor. So you want to be sure to find someone that not only is an ally or has expertise in the area that you'd like to study, but you also want to find someone who is a personality match, who is a good ally if you are disabled. And I can bet lots of people in this room already have really good ally-dar. Like you can just tell when people are supportive and humble and thoughtful. And so I would encourage you to use that ally-dar when you're encountering those mentors. And so some things to look for, of course, are flexibility in terms of the way the person communicates with you, and that they take the time to really answer your questions and have a conversation with you. A good mentor will always take the time to have a long conversation with you, answer all of your questions before you have to make a decision about whether to apply or to accept a program.
Antoinetta, I am working over at NTID Missions Office. And I had some questions personally that I would like to put in my office. So there's books that I've seen about ableism. Do you have any recommendations on authors or including your research? I'm not sure if I can access that, but about ableism. Thank you.
Absolutely. I would love to plug some great authors' research here. There's a great book that's just called Ableism, Causes and Consequences by Michelle Nario-Redmond. She's a fellow social psychologist. I think it is a very thorough accounting of what we know about ableism and psychology. And it came out, I think, just 2 or 3 years ago, so it's very up to date. For those of you who are interested in psychology specifically, I highly recommend any of Rhoda Olkin's work. She is a physically disabled clinical psychologist and has really been a role model to me for ever since I was in graduate school. So she does a lot of great writing around disability affirmative therapy. So, affirming disability as a cultural competency when conducting psychotherapy. Yeah, and then finally, it's free and easy to check out my blog if you want some summaries about research.
I am curious, Dr. Bogart, about your journey from not considering yourself to be disabled, not having that disability identity, to having a proud disability identity. I'm curious about sort of when that aha moment happened and when you identified with other people who have disabilities.
It's such a good question, and so important to me that I do have this strong disability pride now. But I consider myself to have come to it kind of later in life. It was in my mid-20s, right around the same time that I first met other people with Mobius syndrome at that conference, and right when I started graduate school. And I think the reason that I started that journey was thankfully was humble enough to recognize that I could not be the expert alone on Mobius syndrome, and I needed to connect with others who had, similar experiences and to learn from them. I think that's why whenever people ask me advice, that's my number one thing, is to connect with other people with disabilities, because it is so it's so helpful in forming your own disability identity, understanding kind of who you are, the parts of you that are related to your disability or formed by your disability. And it's also useful to see the diversity of disability. So ever since I started connecting with the Mobius community, it kind of gave me the confidence and also helped reduce my own internalized ableism to show up, to be around other people with disabilities, and to start having those important conversations.
All right, then I think unfortunately we are out of time, but I really enjoyed your presentation today. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and your research. It's really fascinating. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.